This is 20 minutes of impact from the United States Energy Association Power Sector Podcast. I'm Herman K. Trabish. I've covered the power sector since 2006, and I currently report for Utility Dive. In this episode of the podcast, my guests are Mark Lebel, Principal for U.S. Research and Strategy with the Venerated Regulatory Assistance Project, which we all call RAP, and Zeyneb Magavi, Executive Director of the Home Energy Efficiency Team, or HEET, not to be confused with the heat that's hitting the East Coast today. They are going to provide an overview of the just released paper they co-authored, Seeking Balance, the Path Forward for Thermal Energy Network Regulation, which explains the thermal energy network concept and the regulation it needs to earn its place in U.S. energy markets. So, Zeyneb, let's start with you, and let's start with this question. What the heck are thermal energy networks? What part do they currently play in U.S. markets? I mean, right now. And what does their potential, no, excuse me, why does their potential justify a hard look at regulatory policy that can support a bigger market role?
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. And the answer uh, to what are thermal energy networks can sometimes vary across the country because everyone seems to want to make their own version of a definition. However, I'm going to answer you by saying it's really a step change from what used to be a district energy system using only a single pipe in a ring design that allows a temperature range that's both heating and cooling from geothermal energy as well as other ambient and low range or low temp energy resources all around us. And because of the design that's a little novel, they're scalable. You can add customers on and off, and you can grow them to a regional scale, unlike some of the more traditional district designs.
So
So, yeah.
excuse me for interrupting, but let me make sure I understand. So the idea is that you could take, let's say, an industrial plant that spews heat and capture that and run a piping system. It used to be, you're saying, one pipe, but now you're thinking in terms of a piping system. Or you could take geothermal sources that are local and capture the heat that comes out of that and run it through this piping system. And you could heat other businesses, other homes, other institutions. Am I saying that? Am I describing the
So,
concept correctly?
so, yes to the idea of there being multiple different types of thermal resources.
Hmm.
But the fundamental infrastructure is kind of universal and replicable, and it's actually moving ambient temperature water around. So something between like 40 80 degrees Fahrenheit. So any customer can heat or cool at any time. And so the temperature of the loop actually kind of fluctuates. It's a really interesting dynamic design instead of static, and it's bidirectional. And so you can add resources and customers on and off across it, really changing the game and really turning it into a scalable utility service, which is why we're looking at regulatory policy. And I would say right now, in terms of you asked the part they play in U.S. energy markets. Oh, minuscule, unless you're counting Hope. So there's like 26 filings in rate case in dockets across the country for demonstration projects by utilities, typically gas utilities, and then there's about 170 projects at some stage that we know of. So this is not massive yet, but since these regulators have to consider it, and it's new and has the potential to grow and is outsized in Hope, we really are at that stage where proactive, deep thought about the regulatory framework and all of the things we've learned from our other utilities for the past 100 years could maybe give us a great start on this one.
Actually replace the heating systems, natural gas heating or electric heating that we have now?
Yes.
So,
Well,
so I think the key thing is it needs to be connected to heat pumps within the buildings,
Yeah.
right? And then that is what heats and cools the houses.
True.
So that's like that combined system is what lets you replace the gas furnace or electric resistance heating or anything else you have going on at your house.
Should Yeah, I skipped that, Mark. The buildings, the distributed heat pumps, and they're geothermal or water source heat pumps, which are like 30-year lifespan and highly efficient. Yeah.
Interesting. Do the heat pumps amplify or capture the heat that comes in and just simply distribute it?
Yeah, they take the kind of perfect keep the heat pumps happy temperature of the supply, and they pull either heating off or they push heating, reject heating into. So that's why they can heat or cool off of the same supply. And every
Interesting.
time a building is heating and pulling the heat out, and another building is cooling and rejecting the heat in, those two loads cancel, and it's like a new kind of energy efficiency. So the more of that mixed use you have, like in an urban environment, the more of a whole new kind of energy efficiency you can capture with this system.
I want to talk to Mark a minute, Zeynep, about this idea of balance. The title itself says "Seeking Balance: The Path Forward for Thermal Energy Network Regulation," and the paper talks about two kinds of balance as the key to the development of thermal energy networks and the development of regulatory policy for them. So I don't really understand those two kinds of balance and how they apply. Mark, can you explain that a little more?
So, right. So whenever you're titling a paper, you need to think of like a synthesizing concept for what you want to teach people, what people to take away from this publication, right? So the concept of balance, I talk about balance. I'm an annoying regulatory lawyer. Zeynep's a technological expert here, and she taught me what a thermal energy network was. So I'm just regurgitating all the things I learned from her. But the idea of balance for the system itself, the key operating principle for the system is keeping the temperature in balance, because you want it to be used for heating and cooling and to be used efficiently by the customer heat pumps, right? So if the temperature of the water gets too cold, or in the worst case freezes, so you've done something really wrong, then it's too difficult to use for, let's make sure I get this right, cooling. But if the temperature of the water gets too no, I got it backwards, right?
Yeah.
If it gets too cold, it's too difficult to use for heating. And if it gets too hot, it's too difficult to use for cooling.
Mhm.
So you want to keep it within the ambient temperature range so you can use it efficiently with the customer heat pumps. The reason why you need geothermal resources or waste heat or attaching it to an ice rink or a subway is to keep the system in an efficient temperature balance range, right? So that's the operating principle for what the system is and how it works and how you have to design and run this new shared asset. Now, the other concept of balance here is, how do we get to a full regulatory framework? What are we worried about in terms of this new service? And starting with sort of a light touch that's more about data collection, learning, and reducing costs in the early stages, and then mapping the steps you need to take to get to a full regulatory framework, because we do think that this is essentially a utility service at some level. We can get into that in more detail.
It's a heating service, right? A heating and cooling service, I guess.
It's energy, right? It's an energy transfer service. Yeah.
Okay.
It's a very
I,
new conceptual thing compared to electricity and gas, actually.
I think one of the things is if you just go to the physics, like electricity is electric energy, this is just thermal energy. We've ignored thermal energy a lot. We don't really count it. Like when someone gets an air source heat pump, they are using electricity, but they're actually using more thermal energy, and we don't measure it or count it.
Well, measuring and counting was basically my next question. Zeynep, let me ask you this. Um, the paper suggests that in order to create a comprehensive regulatory framework for thermal energy networks, you eventually need to have those things so that you can scale this. You have to have some sort of a regulatory framework that everybody who starts to build one knows what the rules are and the costs are and that sort of thing. And the paper suggests how to prioritize the development of that framework by getting data from early deployments.
Yeah.
So I want to know what the elements of that framework are and how data is key to shaping the framework. And I'm particularly interested in uh, the numbers and the costs, because it seems like we wouldn't want to do this unless it saved us a lot of money.
Mhm.
Of course, we're going to save a lot of emissions from that, but I think we've found out in the last few years that the economics are really a driver. So tell us a little bit about the data that you need to build a framework and what that framework would look like.
Well, yeah. On a kind of high level, um, the idea of transporting a kind of nascent demonstrated utility into a utility service with kind of the ability to have a prudency standard to understand and predict performance and make therefore fair rates really relies on a set of knowledge which we don't yet have, right? So we know this thing works. We know all the components work, which is kind of an exciting element for the speed at which we have to transform our energy system. So the components have been around forever. When we put them together like this, how do you do it optimally? To give you an example, just to make it really concrete, we've been currently playing with a bunch of data from one of the first projects, measuring the thermal energy in the ground all the way down, also all of the kind of exchange, and looking at, okay, so if we change the pipe diameter, do we get a higher efficiency on the system? Turns out you do, because you're increasing the energy storage. And so like plotting that out, understanding, okay, well, for the next projects, why don't we change the pipe diameter, and we're going to get an even better outcome for ratepayers. The costs are going to come down, the efficiency and performance are going to go up. And then the next project we're doing, we're measuring the grid impacts, because that's a value that is currently not monetized. And so as we craft the kind of correct or optimized framework for this, we need to put the real data and science in, make data and science-based policy to bring down ratepayer costs, to optimize the different intersections of the system. And this is, it is somewhat, it's interesting because it's bidirectional, because it fundamentally links the grid to thermal, and there isn't currently regulatory mechanisms to do that yet. So the components of data that we need a whole bunch of household and customer data and the heat pumps in the buildings. We also need the distribution infrastructure data, the costs on electricity usage, the impacts on the electric grid. And it's very exciting here in Massachusetts, where I am. There's been a serious investment in that process of data collection. And a national data bank has been built and launched, so that regulators will have those tools in hand to make informed and wise decisions going forward.
They
Can
do.
I
They,
can I ask a
oh
can I
yeah,
ask a
go ahead,
question to
Mark.
Zeynep?
Yeah,
Can you talk about how the potential for winter system efficiencies on the electric grid? Because
absolutely.
that's one of the key values here.
Absolutely. And so, because of that ambient temperature range, I kind of jokingly said that keeps the heat pumps happy. The kind of operating efficiency of the heat pumps stays incredibly steady. So because you're using a steady temperature as a supply, unlike an air source heat pump that's using the coldest day to make heat, to pull heat out of, and the hottest day to push heat into, you have a really high efficiency performance at that winter peak. So you get an enormous cost reduction. There's an Oak Ridge National Lab study that shows, just with the geothermal heat pump alone, a drop from my state of 34% on the grid peak. And so that grid peak data is really critical for affordability.
Let me ask you this, for my understanding. So I think what you're saying is that as it gets colder, a normal heat pump would need to draw more electricity to increase the heat in the building, the home, or what have you.
Yeah.
But because you've got this thermal network that keeps the heat pump at a steady rate, it doesn't get the peak doesn't get bigger because the draw from the power system doesn't spike from that electricity demand of the
Yeah.
heat pumps. Is
Your
that
heat
right?
pump is not working harder to do its job because its supply temperature is steady.
Does the
Yes.
same thing happen with cooling?
Yes. Yes.
And so those summer peaks. Now I know we're entering a world where winter peaks are just as important as summer peaks,
Yeah.
especially in the big troubled PJM system. But they're being out west, where it's we're going to have 100-degree weather this week. That is going to be a big factor for Western peak demand,
Yeah.
right?
And I've had some
Interesting.
conversations out west about potentially even, once quantified, once there's hard data, um, really seeing this as a almost an RPS mechanism. You could meet
I,
grid reduction by deploying thermal networks. Um,
um,
and I think the avoided cost of infrastructure build out is also a factor in there, of course, right?
you don't
And the
have to build
last
more natural gas plants to meet s- rising peaks or
or
anything.
more renewable energy.
Right.
and
That's true.
and
That's
and
true.
then the last part that I think is pretty fun that we're hoping to try sometime soon is that the system, you could control it proactively like a demand response. So there's a massive thermal inertia in a thermal network. And so if you have a known peak, summer or winter, you could proactively heat or cool the loop, or you could host it and really shave the peak in a coordinated action with the electric utility.
Pre-cool or preheat, in other words.
Yeah, exactly.
Interesting. Now, one question. I know that there are certain kinds of thermal networks in Europe.
Mm,
Um, is
yeah.
this different than what they're doing in Europe, or do you have data from Europe?
Yeah, I absolutely have data and work with folks there. I was recently at their European Geothermal Energy Summit. And the vast majority of what they are calling thermal networks are traditional district energy. There's a lot more exploration of geothermal. But they have a much larger and more established district energy industry. They have very few fifth generation, which shifts to that ambient temperature. They're beginning to grow. There's some in Belgium, some in Portugal, a few here and there, and fewer than the US of this single pipe ambient temperature loops. But there's a lot of interest growing, particularly recently in the Netherlands. So it's the unusual spot where the US is actually leading.
Mark, I'm going to get to the last question I want to ask you in just a second, but I just have to ask either one of you to answer this question. In order to make this work, you're going to have more heat pumps installed, and you're going to have to, I assume, dig into the earth for pipes. D- do- is it cost effective to do all that and still have these networks?
Yeah, so that is such a critical aspect of the journey. So we know today that geothermal energy on the life cycle is the lowest cost energy. And that's what we get going into it. So then the question is, can we, and at what scale, build utility scale, which has a little increased efficiency, and keep that affordable, fixed price, non-volatile, local, independent, resilient, and secure energy. And I think there's a lot of that to the hope comment earlier. There is a lot of optimism about that. It's awfully close on the utility piping and infrastructure if you use the full life cycle. The challenge, the big challenge that we have not yet fully resolved is the retrofitting of existing old buildings and all that 100 years of delayed maintenance we've got around here. That doesn't really have a cost effectiveness yet.
No, see, that's the last question, and I'm going to ask this of Mark because he's RAP, and I've depended on Regulatory Assistance Project for years and years to clear these things up. Mark, the paper is clear. There's 3 steps that you need to do to establish regulatory policy for these networks. And you make the point that they should be treated as natural monopolies, and I want you to explain that. You make it clear that planning has to start with the feasibility and thermal resource adequacy before you start thinking about costs, I guess, because the first thing is there enough heat to do it? Geothermal energy is what I'm trying, not heat. And finally, you sort of say that rate making won't be so difficult because it's basically going to be the kind of rate designs for other utility services. But those are 3 key elements of a regulatory policy. Explain them a little a little more detail. First of all, what do you mean by they should be treated as natural monopolies?
So the basic idea there is like a electric distribution network or a gas distribution network. They should be regulated for price, right? And this goes back to the debates that happened 100 years ago for electric and gas, where the basic idea of a natural monopoly is because of the cost structure of these networks, having 2 in the same location is unstable. And that it's more cost effective to just establish a local monopoly and not have what's called at the time wasteful competition, because eventually just one of those providers would get pushed out. So it's easier, simpler, and more convenient, often is a key criteria that people sometimes forget. Way back in the day, there used to be 2 electric distribution networks in some places with double the wires and double the inconveniences.
Nobody getting served if they are too far away from where the network is and it's too expensive to build to them. That's another feature of natural monopolies, I think.
Well, right. And you can when you have a natural monopoly, you can have an obligation to serve and all these other things as well. So you can have an obligation to serve for thermal energy networks. So there's a bundle of regulatory policies that I think we can follow, that we have for vertically integrated electric utilities, electric distribution networks, gas distribution networks in this country, and you can use a lot of the same logic there. Thermal energy resources, in contrast, don't need to be treated as a natural monopoly. You can construct a least cost portfolio across different types of sources, whether that is customers, third-party providers that contract with the network, or the utility-owned geothermal boreholes or other resources that are sort of attached directly to the system. So there's different ways to...
planning has to start with the resources, but you can let the people compete for the resources as long as the system is there to deliver them.
Exactly. So you have to. That gets into the second category you laid out of how do you assure resource adequacy. Essentially, that's more an electric term, but what do we want to coin here for this, Zeyneb? Thermal adequacy?
Sounds good. Resource adequacy. Yeah.
All right. So
Go for it.
so that's the other. You want to make sure the system runs reliably year round for customers, right? You want to have the right assets to balance the system so that it keeps working well. And then the third piece, there's a few interesting rate making angles here. So far in the United States, customer meters have proven to be quite expensive. And you can follow the same principles from other services. On the electric system, it's actually not worth it to put meters on streetlights, right? So you can follow the same logic for thermal energy network customers, and design rates that hopefully are still fair for customers, even though they don't have detailed individual metering. The hope in the longer term is that the cost of those meters will go down through a mix of proactive steps and natural, sort of development, and that we will be able to have, in the hopefully not too distant future, individual customer volumetric rates or other kinds of metered rates. These meters do exist. It's just a question of it's not a question of technology. It's a question of the costs dropping to make them cost effective to install. So in the meantime, setting up a system that's still fair enough, either through tiered customer charges or other techniques, to make them have a fair and efficient way to charge customers for their usage of the system.
Where do you think these kind of networks are going to appear first, assuming that they appear?
they've already appeared. There are live and operating networks here in Massachusetts, in Colorado, and in Minnesota. More coming. There's quite a lot in the pipeline. There's one.
Places?
Sorry.
Zeynep, cold, it sounds like cold places.
So not necessarily. There's a great one in Texas. There's one in Florida. It is, however, you're totally right about temperature extremes. So if you think about it as if you kind of have no major heating or cooling loads, you're not going to pay back your infrastructure that well. I mean, it'll work, but it'll take a long time to pay off in terms of the per energy cost. So yes, colder or hotter or both. Um,
The climate crisis is taking care of that aspect of the policy framework for us, so you don't have to worry about that.
right.
I think we better leave it there. We're running a little short of time. I want to thank you both. My guests have been RAP Principal for U.S. Research and Strategy, Mark Lebel, and HEET, HEET, Executive Director Zeyneb Magavi, for providing new insights into thermal energy networks and the regulatory policy needed to establish them in U.S. energy markets. I also want to thank my producer, Melissa Brown. And as always, I want to thank our listeners for taking the time to check out the USEA Power Sector Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe, like, follow, and share with everybody you know our quest for energy transition solutions.